It took just 8 words from a former president to bring a 43-year-old black congresswoman to tears on live television. But why those 8 words? And what made them echo through churches, barber shops, and classrooms across America? In a country scarred by over 400 years of injustice, where being heard often costs more than staying silent, where the halls of power were never built for women like her, this wasn't just about a name. It was about memory, because sometimes all it takes is a whisper, spoken at the right moment, to shake loose the weight of a lifetime. And when that whisper comes from someone the world already listened to, something shifts. This is not just a story about politics. It's a story about presence, about standing in the room, uninvited, unwelcomed, and choosing not just to stay, but to speak. What does it take for a nation to finally say your name and mean it? For Jasmine Crockett, it began on a gray Monday morning in Washington, D.C., with a budget binder, a worn blue hoodie, and a television that would soon change everything. It was the kind of Monday that didn't need coffee to feel heavy. Outside, the sky over Washington, D.C. was the color of old ash, flat, uninterested, and vaguely threatening, like a city holding its breath. Inside a modest office tucked within the Rayburn building, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair with the slow weariness of someone already 5 hours into a day that had barely begun. Her sneakers were propped against a drawer, her fingers stained faintly with highlighter ink, and her eyes locked on a thick binder filled with budget breakdowns dry enough to turn water to dust. She wore her favorite blue hoodie, the one with "I got receipts" emblazoned across the chest, and her curls were barely tamed, caught up in a soft puff that whispered she had chosen facts over fashion that morning. The pencil stuck into her hair had bite marks she hadn't noticed. Across the room, Ava, her chief of staff and unofficial emotional bodyguard, was tapping furiously at her laptop, earbuds in, shoulders hunched like a soldier in the trenches of bureaucracy. The only sound was the faint clack of keys, the occasional flip of paper, and the low hum of fluorescent lights that made everything feel slightly unreal. The kind of moment where nothing seems urgent until it does. Jasmine flipped a page, paused, then frowned. "How do you misspell appropriations on a federal document?" she muttered, half amused, half exasperated. "You want $4.2 million, but you can't spell money?" She chuckled softly at her own joke, glancing up, hoping Ava would catch it and laugh too. But Ava didn't move. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, frozen, eyes locked on her screen. Then slowly, like someone hearing a far-off sound no one else could hear, Ava pulled out one earbud. Her voice was low, unnervingly calm. "Turn on CNN, now." That single sentence shattered the stillness in the room, not because of the volume, but because of the way it landed, sharp, precise, like a needle to the spine. Jasmine's heart skipped, not panicked, not yet, but alert. She reached for the remote on the corner of her desk, the cheap plastic cool in her hand. A second later, the screen blinked on. Static, then image. It was Barack Obama. Not a rerun, not an old campaign speech recycled on a slow news day. He was live, standing on a stage in Geneva, dressed in navy, a world map behind him like a flag stitched from ambition. Jasmine sat up straighter. Ava stood. Something about the room shifted, as if the temperature dropped or the air grew thinner. The way it does right before a storm hits. And then it happened. A moment so small in time, 8 seconds, maybe less, but so massive in meaning it threatened to change everything. He said her name. No buildup, no teleprompter glitch. Just a pause, a half smile, and then, "Jasmine Crockett is what America needs to remember." The words didn't ring out like thunder. They fell like a pin drop in a silent church, a stillness so sharp it made Jasmine blink. She looked at Ava. Ava didn't move. Jasmine's fingers gripped the binder in her lap a little tighter. Her breath caught, not quite a gasp, more like a pause her body forgot to release. It was only the beginning. And deep inside, beneath the fluorescent lights, beneath the layers of paper and policy and professionalism, something began to stir. Because whatever was about to happen next was going to be remembered. For a split second after those 8 words were spoken, Jasmine Crockett is what America needs to remember. Nothing happened. No breath, no reaction, no movement. The world didn't erupt. It held still. Jasmine didn't flinch, not outwardly, but inside something fractured in absolute silence. Her eyes fixed on the screen, not quite believing what she just heard, and yet knowing, impossibly, instinctively, that it was real. She didn't look away. Couldn't. Across the room, Ava stood like a statue, tablet still in her hands, her lips parted slightly as if caught mid-thought. No blinking, no words. Just a stunned stillness that seemed to stretch and stretch until time itself forgot how to move forward. The screen showed Obama at the podium, the backdrop behind him rich with blues and continents, his posture steady, voice calm, every syllable delivered with deliberate grace. He wasn't reading from notes. He wasn't listing policy. He was naming something sacred. Jasmine's heart beat once, hard, then again, louder. It felt unnatural, as if the rhythm had shifted to match something ancient inside her, ancestral, rooted, trembling with memory. Her fingers curled tighter around the binder in her lap, not for support, but to feel something solid in the midst of emotional vertigo. She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat was tight with disbelief. Ava finally moved, her hand rising slowly to cover her mouth, as if to physically hold in the weight of the moment. It wasn't pride, it wasn't surprise, it was reverence, like watching a miracle arrive without fanfare. Just quiet truth, spoken plainly on a world stage. Obama continued, "She is showing this country that dignity isn't something you're handed. It's something you fight for. Even when the cameras are off, especially when the cameras are off." Those final words, especially when the cameras are off, hit Jasmine like a thunderclap dressed in silk. She blinked, but not from tears, from shock, from something deeper. The room hadn't changed, but the meaning inside it had. The cheap TV, the fluorescent lights, the scattered memos, all of it became sacred in an instant. Not because it was beautiful, but because history had just walked in wearing ordinary clothes. On the screen, images of Jasmine began to fade in and out behind Obama's speech. Clips of her testifying in hearings, standing in hurricane-ravaged districts, kneeling beside elderly women in broken neighborhoods, hugging high school students whose names had never made it past the district line. These weren't campaign shots. They were real, raw, and unfiltered. Snippets of a life lived not for applause, but out of obligation. Jasmine stared, unmoving, as if afraid that blinking would erase the proof. "I never thought he knew my name," she whispered, barely audible, not to Ava, not even to herself, but to the weight of history rising in her chest. And it wasn't a simple sentence. It was a confession, laced with awe, doubt, and something older than both, centuries of silence. Ava stepped closer but said nothing. She couldn't. What was there to say when the impossible just came true? Jasmine's hand drifted beneath her hoodie, fingers curling around a silver key that hung around her neck, one she hadn't taken off since her grandmother gave it to her when she was 10. Suddenly it felt heavier, more real, like it had been waiting for this exact moment to mean something again. In that room, 4 walls, no windows, half lit by duty and deadlines, a name had just become a signal. A lighthouse in a fog of erasure. And though no one had moved, nothing had been louder than the silence that followed those 8 words. "I didn't think he knew my name." Jasmine spoke the words like they'd been hiding inside her for decades, small and sharp, tucked beneath layers of armor she had built piece by piece, year after year, in courtrooms, in council meetings, on front porches, where people didn't have time for hope but still dared to ask for help. The sentence came out quiet, but it carried more weight than thunder. Ava didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply sat down beside Jasmine on the edge of the desk, her presence saying what language couldn't. "You're not crazy. This is real." Jasmine's breath hitched again, softer this time, as if her body was catching up to the moment her mind couldn't process. The image on the screen had shifted to old footage now. Low-res video of her walking through a flooded neighborhood in Louisiana, pant legs soaked, helping a grandmother retrieve family photos from a collapsed porch. That moment wasn't supposed to be seen. It was never tweeted, never filmed for publicity. But somehow, it had found its way here. Her fingers drifted back to the silver key under her hoodie, the one her grandmother gave her when she was 10. It wasn't ornate, just a simple charm dulled at the edges. But it had been given with a sentence Jasmine never forgot. You don't need a crown to lead. Just remember who you're leading. Her grandmother had said it while peeling sweet potatoes, her voice low, steady, and full of a knowing the world rarely listened to. Jasmine had only half understood it then. Now it echoed like prophecy, because on that screen, with a world watching, her leadership had been named. Not qualified, not questioned, just named. And that, in a world built to forget women like her, was sacred. In her mind, Jasmine wasn't in the office anymore. She was back in her grandma's kitchen in South Dallas, grease popping from a skillet, a fan in the window trying to chase away the summer heat. She could see the red check tablecloth, feel the sticky linoleum under her bare feet, hear the hum of gospel music floating out of a dusty radio. That kitchen was where she first learned how to listen, not to what people said, but what they didn't say. It was where she first watched a black woman run a household on grit and prayer and powdered milk. It was where she learned that silence wasn't always weakness. It was strategy, survival. But now silence felt different. It wasn't armor. It was release. The tears didn't come fast. They weren't dramatic or cinematic. They came one by one, slow and certain, like water finding its way through a crack in stone. Ava reached for her hand, but Jasmine didn't unclench it. Not yet. Her grip on the binder had loosened, but she still held it, still grounded in facts, even as history pressed against her ribcage. This wasn't breaking down. It was breaking through. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't campaigned for recognition. She just did the work, often alone, often in rooms that pretended not to see her. But now a single sentence had cracked the ceiling just enough to let the light in. And for the first time in a very long time, Jasmine didn't feel like she was surviving the room. She felt like she was owning it. It wasn't the shouting that cut the deepest. It was the silence. Jasmine Crockett learned that in her very first week as a freshman congresswoman, when the mahogany tables of Capitol Hill felt more like barricades than places of dialogue, and the carpeted halls smelled faintly of generational power. She had arrived prepared, notes printed, blazer pressed, numbers memorized like verses in a sermon. But none of it seemed to matter, because in that room no one had saved her a seat. It was supposed to be a basic subcommittee briefing on infrastructure spending, 20 minutes tops. Jasmine arrived 5 minutes early, like she always did. She had double-checked the schedule, confirmed she was on the list. But when she walked into the room, every chair was already occupied. No one looked up. Not the young aide scrolling his phone, not the senior congressman retelling a golf story for the third time, not even the policy advisor who balanced a dry pastry on her knee like it was more important than policy. They saw her. That was the worst part. They registered her, and they turned back to whatever they thought mattered more. She stood there, holding her notes in one hand, her yellow notepad in the other, shifting her weight from foot to foot. 10 minutes passed. No motion, no gesture, no invitation. At one point, a man adjusted his chair and bumped her leg. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look up. It wasn't just exclusion. It was erasure in real time. Finally, she leaned against the wall and wrote on a Post-it instead of her notepad because she didn't have enough hands to manage both. She took notes anyway. She always did. When the chair of the subcommittee finally opened the floor for comments, she stepped forward, ready. But the gavel dropped too soon. Out of time, he said, glancing past her as if she were furniture someone forgot to move. She smiled politely, said nothing, packed her papers, and left. That afternoon, she stuck that yellow Post-it to the corner of her desk, wrote one sentence beneath it in black ink. They don't have to make space. I'll carve it myself. But carving space meant bleeding sometimes, and that happened 2 days later. It was during another hearing, this one smaller, colder, more intimate in the way that made dismissal even more personal. A senior white congressman, older than her father, leaned across the table, looked her directly in the eye, and asked with a syrupy tone and steel behind his smile, "Sweetheart, are you lost or are you just early?" Time didn't freeze. It twisted. For half a second, Jasmine didn't know what to do, speak or survive. She reflexively smiled, not out of kindness, but out of instinct. It was that smile, sharp-edged, learned early, passed down like armor. The one black women wear when the room turns cold, but you're not allowed to flinch. She sat down at the far end of the table, back straight, pen in hand, nodding along like the words hadn't pierced anything. No one stepped in. No one looked outraged. No one even shifted. It was just another moment that would never make it into the minutes, but would be carved into her memory. That night, in the privacy of the third-floor women's restroom, in the third stall from the left, Jasmine let the tears fall, not in sobs, but in silence, one drop at a time, into the open palm of a woman who knew better than to scream where they could hear her. Racism in Congress didn't always walk in with a torch and a banner. Most days it wore a tailored suit, carried a leather folio, and smiled while deleting your name from the agenda. It shook your hand in public, then planned meetings behind closed doors without inviting your staff. It called you passionate when you spoke with data and emotional when you spoke with truth. It asked for your perspective in front of cameras, then removed your paragraph from the final draft. Jasmine learned that early. Racism in power doesn't shout anymore. It whispers. It documents your presence and denies your participation. It nods when you speak, but never remembers what you said. They didn't forget her name. They erased it. Quietly, efficiently. She'd check her email every morning and see calendar changes no one told her about. Strategy sessions moved up. Policy briefings streamlined without her presence. Talking points rewritten without consultation. Her contributions would be referenced vaguely in memos. A member raised concerns, or worse, the issue was addressed. No attribution, no credit, just vanishing footprints behind her wherever she walked. She once entered a committee room and saw copies of a memo she'd authored, now circulated under someone else's name. No one blinked. No one thought it odd. Not even the person who had claimed it. That was the thing. When power is used to erase you, it doesn't need to explain itself. But Jasmine refused to disappear, so she wrote everything down. Post-it notes bloomed across her desk like wildflowers in a war zone. Dates, names, quotes, room numbers, offhand comments that felt too convenient. She logged it all, not out of paranoia, but precision, because if the system wouldn't keep receipts for her, she'd carry her own. A pink note for the staffer who forgot to email her the committee revisions. A green one for the time a colleague said, "Your voice is important," before voting to strip funding from her district. A yellow one for the day she was left out of a photograph with the headline, "Voices of the Future." They thought she was quiet. She wasn't. She was calculating, listening, building a map of every gap where equity fell through the cracks and filling them with truth too sharp to ignore. And every time she stuck another square to her wall, she repeated the same sentence like a mantra. "If they won't make space, I'll carve it myself." The blade wasn't anger. It was awareness. Awareness that she was fighting ghosts, systemic, shape-shifting, slippery things that couldn't be called out easily because they never left fingerprints. But she saw them, and slowly, methodically, she began to make them visible. Jasmine wasn't looking to be liked. She wasn't playing to be invited in. She was documenting the silence, preparing for the day when the silence would no longer be enough to hold her back. The room was beige and windowless, humming with the dull energy of routine. Staffers yawned into lukewarm coffee, screens flickered with spreadsheets no one fully read, and elected officials glanced at their watches as if hoping time itself would skip this hearing altogether. It was just another fiscal oversight session, a procedural pit stop on the endless highway of bureaucracy. But Jasmine Crockett didn't walk in like it was routine. She came with a binder full of stories, not summaries. And on that morning, she wasn't there to persuade. She was there to remind. She adjusted the mic carefully. No rush, no flourish, just the steady movement of someone who had done this before and knew how to hold still while carrying weight. She didn't open with statistics. She didn't cite percentages or trend lines. She opened to a folded letter and began to read. This is from Angela Morris, 61 years old, Army widow. She writes, "My heat was shut off in December. I used candles to warm my hands." Jasmine paused only long enough to breathe, then turned the page. This one is from Devin Brooks, single father of 3. "I sold my plasma twice this month so my daughter could get her asthma medication." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't plead. It simply carried, clear, measured, as if the words were bricks laid one by one to rebuild something long forgotten. Then it happened. A sound that didn't belong. A laugh. Low, dismissive, careless. A congressman, gray-haired and half-listening, let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head like she'd just told a bedtime fable instead of a cry for help. The air shifted, not immediately, just enough for Jasmine to stop mid-sentence and look up. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the temperature. Her eyes locked on the man like a scalpel finding its incision point. Her hands, still resting on the paper, didn't tremble. Her next words came slow, precise, and razor-edged. "I'm sorry. Do you laugh when veterans lose heat in December?" The room stilled. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, their quiet whir overwhelmed by the silence now pressing down like gravity. She didn't wait for his answer. She didn't need it. "Because that's what this is," she continued, her voice firm as marble. "You want numbers? I'll give you numbers. But don't forget, these are lives. These are your constituents. They fought for this country. They pay your salary. And right now they're begging." No one dared interrupt, not out of politeness, but because interruption would have been desecration. Jasmine didn't yell. She didn't perform. She just held the truth in her voice like it was an oath and laid it bare across the table like evidence. When she finished, she gathered her notes, nodded once to the chair, and walked out of the room without waiting for approval or applause. Later that day, a junior staffer from a local affiliate posted a 12-second clip on Twitter with the caption, "Representative Crockett just ended Congress in one sentence." By dinner time, the clip had crossed 5 million views. By midnight, it was on every major news show in the country. But in that moment, before the cameras, before the headlines, before the hashtags, there was only her, a letter, and a silence so honest it became unforgettable. By morning, the clip was everywhere. CNN ran it on loop, cutting between Jasmine's sharp, deliberate words and the stunned silence that followed, like it was a cinematic moment rather than an unplanned flash of raw truth. Anchors leaned forward in their chairs, repeating her sentence with reverence, dissecting each word as if it were a historical document. "Do you laugh when veterans lose heat in December?" Became not just a quote, it became a challenge, a mirror, a wake-up call. The network's chyron began flashing in bold. Crockett claps back, a moment of reckoning. It ran 17 times before noon, then another 25 before sunset. But that was only the beginning. Twitter exploded. First came the reposts from political junkies, then from teachers, veterans, nurses, janitors, mothers. People who'd never heard of Jasmine Crockett were suddenly quoting her like scripture. Hashtags ignited. Shuri Crockett clapped back. Shuri dignity doesn't shout. Say her name. Within hours, memes surfaced. One showed her mid-sentence, eyes focused like a surgeon, overlaid with the words, "Truth delivered without anesthesia." Another depicted her holding a flaming microphone like a torch, the caption reading, "She didn't speak to be heard. She spoke to be felt." Gospel music edits came next. Slow-motion footage of her walking through the Capitol, layered with organ chords, choir harmonies, and images of historical Black leaders fading in and out like spirits surrounding her stride. Someone created a remix video using her quote as the chorus. Another designed digital fan art with the phrase, "Dignity doesn't shout." But when it does, it sounds like Jasmine. Then came the billboards. Yes, actual billboards. A crowd-funded campaign launched overnight, and by the end of the week, her words were shining above highway exits in Houston, Baltimore, and Chicago. One billboard in Atlanta simply said, "She spoke. We listened." No photo, no branding, just white letters on black. Jasmine's face started appearing on t-shirts, tote bags, and even baby onesies. She wasn't just a politician anymore. She was becoming something else. A symbol, a vessel for voices too often ignored. And yet, through it all, Jasmine said nothing. No tweet, no press release, no interviews. She didn't ride the wave. She stayed anchored, letting the world do what it needed to do with her words. Her only gesture came quietly. In her office, on a corner bulletin board beside a wrinkled floor schedule and a worn copy of the Constitution, she pinned a still image of the CNN broadcast. Beneath it, in her own handwriting, one line: "Dignity doesn't shout." Because for Jasmine, it was never about the noise. It was about what silence could carry. When it came from a place of knowing, of fire, of having waited a lifetime for the world to finally listen. With every headline that praised her, with every clip that went viral, the knives came out just as fast. Conservative talk shows wasted no time. "This is leadership now?" one smug voice quipped on air, his tone soaked in mockery. "Crying in a budget hearing because someone told a sad story? Is this what we're celebrating? Tears?" Laughter followed, rehearsed and hollow, bouncing around studio walls lined with American flags and performative outrage. Another host chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "8 words and she crumbles." Imagine if she actually had to face war. There it was, the old trick, older than the Capitol itself. Diminish the emotion, erase the substance, attack the vessel so you don't have to face the truth it carried. But then, something unplanned happened. A woman called in. Her voice was steady, no tremble, no performance, just quiet, lived-in fire. "Sir," she said, pausing long enough for the line to fall still, "we've been fighting wars you couldn't imagine." The host tried to cut her off, but she continued. "You say 8 words made her cry? We've waited over 400 years to hear words like that, spoken with truth and power and no apology. That wasn't weakness. That was release." The silence that followed wasn't technical. It was spiritual. The host had no comeback, none that wouldn't make him smaller. Other voices emerged. A retired general interviewed on a late-night panel leaned forward as other guests debated whether Crockett's rise was earned or just symbolic. He didn't yell. He just spoke with the quiet conviction of someone who's handed out folded flags and seen real courage. "I've given medals for less bravery," he said plainly. What she does, walking into that chamber every day, speaking with that kind of clarity, knowing full well what they whisper behind her back, that's courage. You don't have to agree with her politics to respect her posture. His words didn't trend, but they found their way into corners of America that recognized truth when they heard it. Not because it was loud, but because it didn't flinch. Still, the backlash was relentless. Editorials accused her of performative grief. Radio hosts called her a liberal mascot. Think pieces wondered aloud if Obama's comment was scripted sympathy or calculated branding. But Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't explain her tears. She didn't qualify her calm, because she knew something the critics didn't. Dignity doesn't ask for permission to be visible. It simply exists and dares you to confront your discomfort. In a culture addicted to sound bites and spectacle, her silence was louder than their shouting. And while pundits debated her legitimacy on camera, in living rooms across the country, people weren't questioning her. They were recognizing her. Sometimes that's more dangerous than any speech. As the media storm raged on, segments dissecting her tone, her tears, her timing, pundits lining up to praise or pounce, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. No tweet, no press conference, no rebuttal disguised as clarity. While the world shouted around her, she stood still, calm as bedrock, letting the echo pass. Her response came not through words, but through one quiet gesture. On the bulletin board in the far corner of her office, wedged between a printout of next week's committee calendar and a faded photo of her law school graduation, she pinned a simple screenshot of the CNN broadcast. It showed her mid-sentence, eyes sharp, lips slightly parted, just before the room went silent. Below the image, scribbled in her handwriting on a torn scrap of notepaper, were 4 words. "Dignity doesn't shout." That note wasn't meant for cameras. It wasn't meant for applause. It was meant for her staff, her interns, and herself. A reminder that leadership isn't a volume setting, it's a stance. And that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do in a world built on noise is refuse to play its game. As speculation mounted, was this a political stunt? Was Obama's remark prearranged? Was Crockett being groomed for a national spotlight? A short statement from the former president's communications office cut through the frenzy like a clean blade. The mention of Congresswoman Crockett was not scripted. The president spoke from the heart. 9 words, no elaboration, no bullet points. But it landed with the weight of truth in a nation starved for sincerity. That single confirmation unraveled the fabric of spin surrounding the moment. Because what shook people wasn't just that Barack Obama had named Jasmine Crockett on a global stage. It was that he had done so unscripted, unprompted, uncoached. In a culture addicted to polish and pre-clear talking points, this was raw. It was real. And for a public that had grown cynical toward everything political, that kind of authenticity was both jarring and disarming. Suddenly, this wasn't just a viral clip. It was a turning point. Not because it changed policy, not yet, but because it changed perception. It made people stop scrolling, made them lean in, made them feel something they hadn't felt in a long time. That maybe, just maybe, someone in power was paying attention to someone who wasn't supposed to matter. But Jasmine didn't bask in it. She didn't pose for it. She didn't even speak to it. Because she understood something that most politicians forget the moment cameras arrive. That being heard isn't always about being loud. Sometimes it's about holding your ground so firmly that others have no choice but to listen. And so, while the headlines spun and the algorithms fed on her image, Jasmine Crockett went back to work, binder in hand, heels clicking softly down marbled halls. Because for her, the moment had never been about the microphone. It had always been about the message. By the 3rd day, the steps outside Jasmine Crockett's office had become a zoo of microphones and long lenses, all pointed at the same unremarkable door. Journalists leaned against the marble columns like impatient pilgrims, scribbling in notepads, adjusting their collars, waiting for a headline to walk out and speak. The questions they rehearsed weren't really questions. They were sound bites wrapped in punctuation. Did the president's words surprise you? Is this your moment? Are you planning a Senate run? She had remained silent since the viral eruption, but silence doesn't last in politics. Not without people trying to fill it in for you. So when the door finally opened, all chatter stopped. There was no press aid, no prepared backdrop, no red lipstick, no carefully chosen power blazer. Jasmine stepped out wearing a muted gray suit, her natural curls pulled back, her expression calm but unreadable. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She stepped to the mic like she was stepping into court, collected, precise, already knowing the weight of what would come next. And then she spoke. "This ain't a show," she said, her voice low, deliberate, every syllable landing like a flat-footed truth. "It's a reckoning." The press line hushed. No camera shutters clicked. No one interrupted. Her voice wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. It had that rare quality, the kind that didn't ask to be remembered, but refused to be forgotten. "Some of y'all want to know if I'm writing this moment," she continued. "Let me be clear. I didn't ask for my name to be spoken, but if it's out there, then I'm going to make sure it means something." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't branding. It was reclamation of narrative, of presence, of the right to exist on her own terms. Reporters shifted, unsure how to respond. Because this wasn't politics as usual. This was something different, something weightier, something sacred. She paused, eyes scanning the crowd, not defiantly, but knowingly. "I'm not here because it's easy. I'm here because it's necessary. I've got neighbors who still boil water before brushing their teeth. I've got veterans rationing insulin. You think I care about applause when my people are still waiting for clean water?" That was the moment the press line fell still, not out of confusion, but out of recognition. She wasn't auditioning for their approval. She was holding them accountable for what they had failed to see for too long. Jasmine Crockett didn't frame her rise as ambition. She framed it as redemption, for the ignored, the overlooked, the invisible, For the grandmothers with tired feet and folded prayers. For the children eating lunch in classrooms still cooled by broken fans. For the neighborhoods where dignity had been taxed, redlined, and repackaged into slogans. She wasn't trying to be the next anything. She was trying to make sure she wasn't the last. And that day beneath the dome that had once erased her, Jasmine didn't just speak. She made the room listen. The air in South Dallas felt different from Washington, D.C. Thicker, slower, honest in a way politics never could be. When Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the black SUV in front of her childhood school, the sun wasn't yet high, but the heat was already rising off the concrete in waves. She hadn't walked through these doors in over 15 years, not since her mother's funeral. Not since the days when her voice was considered too loud for a little black girl, and her questions were marked as disruptions, not potential. She was here now not as a student, but as someone the world had finally decided to see. The school hadn't changed much. New security cameras blinked from corners where old posters used to hang. But the building still smelled the same, a mix of industrial floor wax, processed cheese, and sun-baked cinder block. As she walked down the hallway, she passed the trophy case that never held her name, the same lockers with chipped corners and dented doors, and a class photo on the wall where her younger self sat in the second row, arms crossed, braids tight, eyes defiant. It wasn't until she stepped into the cafeteria that something inside her broke a little. The long metal tables were still scratched with initials from kids long gone. The trays were the same pale beige. And then she saw it. A small carton of milk placed as a joke on the tray a lunch lady handed her for old time's sake. She smiled at first, until she flipped it over. Expired. By 3 days. The smile vanished. Her hands stiffened around the carton. She didn't say a word. But Ava, standing just behind her, saw the change in her posture. Jasmine set the milk down, gently, as if any sudden movement might make the entire cafeteria collapse under the weight of what hadn't changed. After the tour, the principal invited her into his office. He was older now, softer around the eyes, but still carried that same clipboard like it was armor. The walls were decorated with motivational slogans, laminated and stapled unevenly. Work hard, dream big, be respectful. Success starts with you. As the photographer stepped out, he cleared his throat, voice low and dry. I just wanted to say something, he began, not meeting her eyes at first. We never thought one of ours would make it like this. We're proud, truly. But I need to say sorry. Jasmine blinked, caught off guard. Sorry we didn't treat you like you would, he continued. You were smart even then. You had fire, but we didn't nurture it. We told you to quiet down. Sit still. We missed it. We missed you. There was no anger in her face, only exhaustion. Not the kind that sleep could fix, but the kind that builds over years of being told, your light is too much for the room. She nodded once, slowly. It wasn't just this school, she said. It's the system. You didn't see me because they taught you not to. The principal looked down at his pen, ashamed. If I could go back, he said softly, I'd give you a front row seat and a microphone. She reached across the table and tapped the pen he held. Then give it to the ones still here, she replied. It's not too late for them. And with that, she stood up, not in anger, not in triumph, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had outgrown the place that once tried to shrink her. The classroom was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she had simply grown too much to fit inside the frame of it. Jasmine sat at the front of a third-grade class, the same grade she was in when a teacher once told her she talked too much to ever go far. The walls were lined with construction paper suns and hand-drawn flags, and the faint smell of dry erase markers mixed with something sweet and warm. Maybe cafeteria cornbread or a forgotten juice box under someone's desk. Kids squirmed in their seats, some with legs too short to touch the floor, some already slouched like miniature adults waiting for life to begin. And then they looked at her, some with awe, some with suspicion, and one little girl in the front row with eyes so wide and still, it felt like she was watching someone walk out of a storybook. Jasmine held the book in her lap like something sacred. The cover was soft matte blue with white block letters that read, "You are bigger than the chair they give you." She had written it in a hotel room one night after a hearing that left her gutted and quiet. It wasn't planned. The words just spilled out. About a girl named Nevi who always raised her hand, asked questions that didn't have neat answers, and sat in a chair that never quite fit. The story wasn't just fiction. It was memory reimagined. She began to read, her voice low and warm, every sentence carrying the rhythm of bedtime stories and Sunday morning hymns. Nevi's feet dangled, her elbows bumped, and her dreams curled like smoke up to the ceiling. Her teacher said, "Your words are too big." Nevi smiled. "That's because my dreams are too wide for this chair." The children giggled, and Jasmine smiled. Not the poised, practiced smile of politics, but the full, soft curve of someone who remembered what it felt like to be laughed at and to laugh anyway. She turned another page. "My voice is not a problem," Nevi told them. "It's a promise." Jasmine didn't look up right away, but when she did, she caught it. That flicker, that shift, the small sound of recognition from somewhere in the second row. A little boy, maybe 8, maybe 9, had leaned slightly forward, hand hovering over his desk, and whispered almost to himself, "That's me." She felt something move inside her, not sharp like the battles she'd fought in hearings, not hot like the tears she never let fall in front of cameras. This was something quieter, warmer, a thread pulled loose from an old wound, one that had never fully closed until now. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Healing, it turned out, didn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it tiptoed in on a child's breath, wrapped in a single sentence. She closed the book slowly, let the silence linger, then looked at the class. Not as a politician, not as a guest, but as someone who had once sat in a desk just like theirs and wondered if her voice would ever be more than a disruption. "Did that really happen?" a girl near the back asked. Jasmine smiled, soft and sure. "Parts of it," she said. "And the rest? That part is about you." The photo arrived in a plain white envelope with a crooked stamp and no return address. It came with no letter, no explanation, just an image folded twice and a sticky note that read, "Thought she might want to see this." Jasmine was between meetings when Ava slipped it onto her desk. There was no fanfare, just the quiet nudge of something that didn't need to shout to be important. Jasmine unfolded the photo carefully, and when her eyes landed on it, she stopped breathing for a moment. It showed a boy, maybe 10 years old, maybe younger, standing in a patch of dirt no wider than a parking space. His jeans were too short, shoes worn at the edges, and in one hand he held a bent plastic spoon covered in soil. Behind him were 3 crooked tomato plants, barely sprouted. But what caught Jasmine's eye was the sign. It was taped to an old pizza box, written in thick black marker, letters uneven but urgent. It read, "We don't need candy. We need tools." His name, she would later learn, was Noah. He lived on the east side of Detroit with his grandmother, who had shown him the clip of Jasmine's hearing one night on a borrowed phone, holding it out like a lantern. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood enough. He saw the way she didn't yell, but still made everyone listen. Saw the way the room changed when she read those letters, and he turned to his grandmother and said, "That lady talks like she knows us." The next day, Noah went outside with a plastic bag of dollar store seeds, a broken rake he borrowed from a neighbor, and a plastic spoon he found in the back of a drawer. The lot behind their apartment building was filled with crushed soda cans and cigarette butts, but Noah didn't flinch. He just started digging. When people asked what he was doing, he said, "Making space." Jasmine says we don't have to wait. His grandmother eventually wrote a short note to Jasmine's office, enclosing the photo. "He calls it Jasmine's garden," she wrote. "He waters it every day with a measuring cup. Says he's growing food in fairness." Jasmine didn't call a press conference. She didn't post it online. Instead, she printed the photo and placed it in a simple black frame. Then she cleared a spot beside her mother's old notebook, the one with the first sentence her mother ever wrote to her. "Make them see what they ignored." Now the photo sat next to it, not as decoration, but as proof. Proof that leadership doesn't always look like podiums and power suits. Sometimes it looks like dirt under your nails and cardboard signs that remind the world what matters. Because in a country where so many kids are told to sit still, Noah had chosen to plan instead. And Jasmine understood then, he wasn't waiting for the future. He was already growing it. Long after the headlines faded and the hashtags slowed, Jasmine's voice kept moving, not in viral waves but in quiet, steady pulses, like a heartbeat that refused to quit. Her words, once uttered in a sterile congressional chamber, found new life in the most unexpected places. In a church on the south side of Chicago, her floor speech played on a loop during Sunday service, echoing through stained glass and beneath painted ceilings that had seen both revival and funeral. Elderly women in pressed white dresses dabbed at their cheeks as her voice filled the sanctuary. Not preaching, not shouting, just telling the truth in a tone that felt familiar, like something their own daughters might have said if the world had listened sooner. In a middle school civics class in Baton Rouge, a teacher dimmed the lights and pressed play on the video of Jasmine reading letters from struggling Americans. The students leaned forward, some wide-eyed, some silent. The assignment afterward wasn't multiple choice. It was personal. Write your own testimony, the teacher said. What would you read to Congress if they were finally ready to hear you? One boy wrote about his father being deported. A girl wrote about living in a shelter and never raising her hand in class because her clothes smelled like mildew. Jasmine wasn't there to read those letters, but she had opened the door that allowed them to be written. In barbershops across the country, those unofficial town halls of Black America, her name came up between discussions of basketball stats and bills. Did you see what Crockett said? One barber would ask, pausing mid-fade. Someone would pull out a phone, play the clip, and the room would fall still. She didn't flinch, another would say. She spoke like my mama when she meant business. Soon, laminated photos of Jasmine joined the framed prints of Malcolm Martin and Muhammad Ali, each of them immortalized mid-action, mid-sentence, mid-fight. Murals started appearing, first in Philadelphia, then Oakland, then Birmingham. Not commissioned, not corporate, just walls claimed by local artists who saw something in her worth preserving. One showed her holding a gavel like a torch, flame made of folded letters. Another depicted her with a shadow behind her, shaped like Harriet Tubman. These weren't likenesses. They were affirmations, symbols painted in color so the world couldn't look away again. And around kitchen tables in homes with cracked linoleum floors and humming refrigerators, people argued, agreed, quoted her, and sometimes just played the clip again in silence. Parents showed their kids. Grandparents folded napkins over their mouths when their voice broke unexpectedly. Her name became not just a person, but a question. What would Crockett do? Because legacy doesn't always live in marble statues or official archives. Sometimes it's kept alive in the hush of a living room, passed between generations over dinner or during a pause between the evening news and the dishes. And that's where Jasmine Crockett's story settled, not on the news cycle's front page, but in the permanent archive of memory, of kinship, of a community that finally saw itself and believed it was worth remembering. The auditorium was dimly lit, the kind of soft amber glow that made everything feel intimate, even with cameras rolling and a dozen microphones hiding in plain sight. It was a televised town hall, not meant to make headlines, just a thoughtful evening of questions and reflections, hosted by a former president who had once commanded stadiums. Barack Obama sat relaxed, one ankle resting atop his knee, sleeves rolled, no tie, just presence. He wasn't there to lead. He was there to listen, to reflect. And yet history has a way of arriving when no one's looking for it. Halfway through the evening, a young woman stood up in the middle row. She looked barely out of college, nerves trembling at the edges of her voice. President Obama, she asked, with everything going on, from division at home to conflict abroad, what still gives you hope? The gymnasium lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a soft halo over 100 plastic folding chairs filled with teenage girls. Mostly black and brown, mostly quiet, mostly unsure if the world had a place for them beyond statistics and silence. Some wore uniforms 2 sizes too big. Others fiddled nervously with the sleeves of their hoodies. They sat in neat rows, sneakers squeaking against the waxed floor, eyes darting between each other and the stage, as if still unsure this was really happening. Jasmine Crockett stood before them, not behind a podium, not on a platform, just standing, holding a note card she wouldn't read from, dressed simply in a rust-colored blouse and slacks, Hair pulled back with intention, not for style, but for focus. She didn't come to perform. She came to reach them. The microphone squeaked slightly as she adjusted it, but she didn't flinch. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but not small. Today, she said, looking not at the back of the room, but into the faces nearest her. Someone you've seen on the covers of books and walls of classrooms reminded me that I carry a torch. A few girls leaned forward, drawn by the rhythm of something real. But I want to say this to you, Jasmine continued, pausing long enough for the silence to settle like velvet over the room. I just want every little girl who looks like me to know. She took a breath, not to gather herself, but to let the truth arrive fully formed. We are not decoration. Her voice didn't rise. It deepened. We are declaration. And there it was. The room didn't erupt. It inhaled. One long collective breath held tight in chests that had never heard anyone say it like that. Then the shift came, first in the shuffling of feet, then in the slow swell of applause that grew not out of obligation, but out of recognition. A girl in the second row wiped her eyes. Another whispered, "That's right," under her breath like a prayer passed between friends. A teacher standing at the back nodded slowly, hand to heart, like she was witnessing something she didn't realize she had been waiting her whole career to see. Jasmine didn't soak it in. She stood still, letting the moment wrap around the room. She had spoken to their spine, not their attention span. This wasn't a soundbite. It was a mirror. And for the first time in her public life, she didn't just feel seen. She was seen, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as someone who had once sat where they now sat, wondering if the world would ever make room for her voice, or if she'd have to carve it herself. She stepped down from the mic slowly, without ceremony. Behind her, the echo of her words lingered like music that refused to fade. When Jasmine Crockett returned to Congress, there were no cameras waiting outside, no crowds pressing against velvet ropes, no headlines screaming her arrival. The media frenzy had moved on to fresher stories, the algorithms distracted by something louder, shinier, more immediate. And Jasmine, she was exactly where she wanted to be, walking through the marbled halls of the Capitol with a folder under her arm, a pen clipped to her blazer, and her heels clicking softly like punctuation marks against the floor. There was no entourage, just Ava beside her, as always, in a silence that felt earned, not empty. Her days resumed their rhythm, early meetings, policy briefings, long committee hearings that tested patience and posture. She read bill drafts until her eyes blurred, negotiated amendments that chipped away at generational neglect, and listened to constituents with the full weight of her presence, even when the stories repeated, even when the funding didn't. She wasn't chasing applause. She was chasing outcomes. There were no viral moments now, just real work, the kind that doesn't trend, the kind that doesn't make prime time, but changes lives all the same. A line in a housing bill that ensured storm-damaged roofs in forgotten neighborhoods got fast-tracked. A clause tucked into a budget proposal that restored funding for after-school meals in zip codes where hunger had long been normalized. Quiet victories, invisible scaffolding holding up lives most people in power never thought to ask about. Jasmine never mentioned the card in her pocket, the one from Obama. She never once quoted it, never showed it off, never even referred to it when asked about him. But she carried it like a compass, not because it pointed her forward, but because it reminded her why she started. She didn't need the world to keep saying her name. She needed the systems that had ignored names like hers for generations to finally do their job. There were still looks in the hallway, some admiring, some dismissive, some wary. But she had long stopped measuring her worth by the expressions of others. She had walked through too many rooms designed to erase her to believe she needed permission to belong in any of them. Jasmine wasn't just representing her district anymore. She was representing a possibility, a different kind of leader, forged not in legacy or lineage, but in fire and clarity and relentless care. And though she still carried the same binder, the same post-its, the same highlighter streak printouts that marked her early days, there was something new now. Not in her wardrobe, not in her voice, but in her presence, a groundedness, a still flame. She wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a torchbearer, not just for black women, not just for the silenced, but for something deeper, for dignity and democracy, and the radical belief that truth, when carried with grace, can still make policy. There was no statue built, no monument unveiled, no commemorative stamp printed with her face. And yet something had shifted, subtle but seismic, not just in Congress or in the neighborhoods she served, but in the consciousness of a nation that had long struggled to say certain names without first apologizing for their existence. Jasmine Crockett didn't need marble to mark her legacy. The echo of her name now lived in something much harder to chisel away: memory, the kind passed down in stories, the kind written into textbooks not by historians, but by the children who lived through her impact. She stood one evening at her window, office lights dim, the city outside buzzing with the sound of lives continuing. In her hands, the old notebook her mother had once filled with phrases too big for a kitchen table, and next to it, the framed photo of Noah and his garden, its edges slightly worn from her fingertips, brushing over it so often. Behind her, the walls were bare of awards. She kept her accolades in action. That week, another bill had passed, a quiet one. It wouldn't make the front page, but it meant that girls in rural school districts would have guaranteed access to menstrual health supplies because someone finally asked them what they needed. And someone finally listened. Jasmine didn't attend the press briefing. She sat with her staff, reviewed district data, and prepared for the next floor vote. Because history to her was not an event, it was an accumulation of efforts, of echoes, of names spoken where silence used to live. And in that reflection, the truth revealed itself gently, like light crawling across a worn wooden floor. History doesn't begin with a bang. Sometimes it starts with a whisper, a name spoken aloud. And this time, the world didn't flinch. It leaned in. She thought about the first moment, the 8 words that had changed everything. How Obama had said her name not for ceremony, but with intention. Jasmine Crockett is what America needs to remember. He had given her no stage, no script, just space, and she had filled it, not with spectacle, but with purpose. Now, years later, the noise had faded. The hype had passed, but her work remained steady and persistent, like the pulse of something alive under the surface of a country trying to grow into its promise. Not every story ends with fireworks. Not every legacy is born in grandeur. Some are planted in soil, taped to pizza boxes, whispers in gymnasiums, murals on brick walls, lines in legislation, moments in silence. And Jasmine Crockett, lawyer, congresswoman, daughter, listener, flame carrier, was never chasing history. She was making room for it, so others could follow. He said 8 words. She lived the next million, and the world finally listened. His grandmother eventually wrote a short note to Jasmine's office, enclosing the photo. He calls it Jasmine's garden, she wrote. He waters it every day with a measuring cup, says he's growing food and fairness. Jasmine didn't call a press conference. She didn't post it online. Instead, she printed the photo and placed it in a simple black frame. Then she cleared a spot beside her mother's old notebook, the one with the first sentence her mother ever wrote to her. Make them see what they ignored. Now the photo sat next to it, not as decoration, but as proof. Proof that leadership doesn't always look like podiums and power suits. Sometimes it looks like dirt under your nails and cardboard signs that remind the world what matters. Because in a country where so many kids are told to sit still, Noah had chosen to plant instead. And Jasmine understood then, he wasn't waiting for the future, he was already growing it. Long after the headlines faded and the hashtags slowed, Jasmine's voice kept moving, not in viral waves but in quiet, steady pulses, like a heartbeat that refused to quit. Her words, once uttered in a sterile congressional chamber, found new life in the most unexpected places. In a church on the south side of Chicago, her floor speech played on a loop during Sunday service, echoing through stained glass and beneath painted ceilings that had seen both revival and funeral. Elderly women in pressed white dresses dabbed at their cheeks as her voice filled the sanctuary. Not preaching, not shouting, just telling the truth in a tone that felt familiar, like something their own daughters might have said if the world had listened sooner. In a middle school civics class in Baton Rouge, a teacher dimmed the lights and pressed play on the video of Jasmine reading letters from struggling Americans. The students leaned forward, some wide-eyed, some silent. The assignment afterward wasn't multiple choice. It was personal. Write your own testimony, the teacher said. What would you read to Congress if they were finally ready to hear you? One boy wrote about his father being deported. A girl wrote about living in a shelter and never raising her hand in class because her clothes smelled like mildew. Jasmine wasn't there to read those letters, but she had opened the door that allowed them to be written. In barbershops across the country, those unofficial town halls of Black America, her name came up between discussions of basketball stats and bills. "Did you see what Crockett said?" one barber would ask, pausing mid-fade. Someone would pull out a phone, play the clip, and the room would fall still. "She didn't flinch," another would say. "She spoke like my mama when she meant business." Soon, laminated photos of Jasmine joined the framed prints of Malcolm Martin and Muhammad Ali, each of them immortalized mid-action, mid-sentence, mid-fight. Murals started appearing, first in Philadelphia, then Oakland, then Birmingham. Not commissioned, not corporate, just walls claimed by local artists who saw something in her worth preserving. One showed her holding a gavel like a torch, flame made of folded letters. Another depicted her with a shadow behind her, shaped like Harriet Tubman. These weren't likenesses. They were affirmations, symbols painted in color so the world couldn't look away again. And around kitchen tables in homes with cracked linoleum floors and humming refrigerators, people argued, agreed, quoted her, and sometimes just played the clip again in silence. Parents showed their kids. Grandparents folded napkins over their mouths when their voice broke unexpectedly. Her name became not just a person, but a question. What would Crockett do? Because legacy doesn't always live in marble statues or official archives. Sometimes it's kept alive in the hush of a living room, passed between generations over dinner or during a pause between the evening news and the dishes. And that's where Jasmine Crockett's story settled, not on the news cycle's front page, but in the permanent archive of memory, of kinship, of a community that finally saw itself and believed it was worth remembering. The auditorium was dimly lit, the kind of soft amber glow that made everything feel intimate, even with cameras rolling and a dozen microphones hiding in plain sight. It was a televised town hall, not meant to make headlines, just a thoughtful evening of questions and reflections, hosted by a former president who had once commanded stadiums. Barack Obama sat relaxed, one ankle resting atop his knee, sleeves rolled, no tie, just presence. He wasn't there to lead. He was there to listen, to reflect. And yet history has a way of arriving when no one's looking for it. Halfway through the evening, a young woman stood up in the middle row. She looked barely out of college, nerves trembling at the edges of her voice. "President Obama," she asked, "with everything going on, from division at home to conflict abroad, what still gives you hope?"